We may as well get started. Welcome everyone. I'm Caitlin Congdon, Field Crop Specialist and Acting Vegetable Specialist at Perennia. And this is the next installment of our Dialing in Irrigation seminar series. Today we're going to be talking about fertigation and integrating nutrient options with irrigation. Just a couple of Zoom housekeeping things before we get going. Everybody has their audio and video turned off during the webinar. And if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you prefer, you can also use the chat function for questions. And my co-host, Hugh Liu, who's Perennia's wild blueberry specialist, will be monitoring the chat and question and answer box throughout the session. So at Perennia, our vision is that Nova Scotia is recognized as a world leader in producing innovative, environmentally responsible, safe food of impeccable quality. And our mission is to support the growth, transformation, and economic development in Nova Scotia's agriculture, seafood, and beverage sectors. Perennia is a multifaceted company. And this workshop is part of our Agricultural Field Services division. In field services, we offer production advice, disease and pest identification and management, help address emerging and critical industry issues, develop workshops and other training, and do research and help producers be environmentally and economically sustainable. Many people are probably familiar with our food safety team, who help producers and processors meet their food safety goals through training and on-site assessments. Our product development team has been doing some really neat things with businesses in Nova Scotia, assisting them in creating new products, fine-tuning processes, improving shelf life, etc. There is also the Agri-Food Accelerator Program, which is designed for current and aspiring agri-food and beverage businesses in Nova Scotia, and it supports commercialization and access to new markets. Perennia is also starting to offer some lab services. We have a plant health lab that is working with the grape and small fruit industries to do virus testing. We also have a cannabis lab in Truro that provides analytical services for that industry. The minister has also asked that we expand our mandate into the fisheries sector. So we have undertaken initiatives in this area in food safety, product development, and so on. You can see all the details on our website. Just a little plug for the Minister of Agriculture digital series. There's some more sessions coming up the end of March and throughout April. And there's also a series for the fisheries sector. So if any of those are of interest, you can check out our website for more information. So as I said, this has been part of our Dialing in Irrigation webinar series. In previous sessions, we covered the influence of soils on managing crops during drought, planning and designing of a drip irrigation system, operating and managing a drip irrigation system, and pivots and guns, which was irrigation system management for those systems. If you missed any of our previous sessions, they've all been recorded and are available on Perennia's YouTube page. So on to today's topic, which is fertigation and integrating nutrients into irrigation. Our guest speaker today is Sebastian Margarit, who is the VP of Informatics and Agronomy with NutriAg. He's specialized in modeling soil and tissue data related to grower relevant yield and quality outcomes, and is currently developing modern artificial intelligence modeling methods to interpret the plant and soil ionome. He's also a passionate apple farmer on the North Shore of Nova Scotia and is interested in exploring the role of secondary and micronutrients in improving yield and quality outcomes for farmers. So with that, I will hand the reins over to you.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. I'm going to try to share a screen here. Hopefully it doesn't screw up in mid-process. Can you see that?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. So thank you very much for inviting me today. I noticed there's some friends in the group today, so that's always nice. Nice to see you guys. Thanks for coming out to support. Looking at the concept of fertigation and even irrigation in general, it's something that I've kind of paid attention to the last 11 or 12 years. We do fertigate on our farm, and we also irrigate in other locations as well. So I wanted to kind of share some of the experiences that we've had, also kind of how I got there. So there's going to be some math later. So unfortunately, people who hate math, there will be math, but there are pictures for those who hate seeing mathematics but love to see pictures. So hopefully everybody will be somewhat pleased with something here today. I'm going to make a quick plug just to let you know, I work for a company called NutriAg. We also do a lot of these information sessions, so separate to a lot of what you guys are doing here at Perennia. But we also have a website called NutriAg Academy, and we just encourage people to check that out for more information about agronomy and soils, and also how to manage foliar nutrients. We also have an MEY club in various different crops. We just finished our 5 series for the year, but they're also recorded. So there's sessions on potatoes, carrots, onions, apples, almonds, in case somebody wants to grow almonds or hazelnuts, and then also on corn and soy. So we're talking about irrigation and fertigation. And so part of that is, a question of how did we get here? So I'm sure that many people are aware of the concept of climate change. If you're not, then I would suggest asking your kids, because they probably know a lot about it with the schools. But what I will mention is we are in a region where things are getting warmer and potentially a little bit more humid in some cases of projections, and also drier in other ones. So it's a very variable forecast as to what to expect going forward. When I started working in agriculture 10, 11 years ago, there was a lot of work in potatoes that had been done in the 90s by McCain's, for instance, looking at things like pivots. And I was told, there's a lot of really expensive lawn ornaments now in New Brunswick and in PEI, because everybody that bought irrigation found that it was better to park it on the tree lines than it was to actually use them. And that was, the 90s experience when they were first taking a look at this concept. And I think everybody will agree that things have changed quite significantly from that time. And if you fast forward to last year, where we had probably the worst drought in history on the island. I know the valley got a lot of timely rains that we missed on the north side of Nova Scotia as well. But it's going to be dealt your way one of these days coming up. And it was, a couple of years ago, you had a pretty significant season where the island caught a few breaks. So if we look at things like the forecasts for temperature, you'll notice where we're located right here in this gigantic pool of dark red. That should give you a pretty decent indication of what to expect. But at the same time, as we're going to go through this presentation, a part of the problem that we have here in Nova Scotia is we're really used to getting precipitation. So it's relatively challenging when you try to adopt an external sort of perspective to both irrigating and fertigating, especially with fertigating. So I want to kind of contextualize some of these discussions here as well. And this is just my opinion. So there might be somebody, I'm sure there's somebody that will completely disagree. And I'm just giving it to you the way that I've interpreted over the last 10 or so years as it's come my way. And I've worked with farmers with irrigation and fertigation. And same thing here, if you look at the precipitation index, the browner you get, the less you should expect compared to your normal forecast. And notice that Nova Scotia, except for maybe autumn, is sitting on a fair amount of brown there. So again, depends on who's giving you a forecast, and obviously climate's relatively difficult to predict. However, we do know the general trends are moving in this direction. So this is why it's so important, and it's great to see Perennia taking the initiative here, but it's so important to see how we can integrate these systems. And in fact, Nova Scotia, has probably adopted these practices a lot more than I've seen in the rest of the Maritimes. So I think we're already ahead. A lot of that probably has to do with the fact that you have very, very coarse sands in the valley. Most of your production area is sitting on, even your heavier quote unquote soils are much lighter than my lightest soils that I, brag about up here. So if you look at most of the production, even in central PEI, they're sitting on loam as well. So realistically, I think you guys have been the early adopters. So you've seen some benefits from that, I'm sure, on your own farms. And we can maybe talk about how we can integrate some changes. So I'm going to give you just a little outline of what we're going to cover today. First, like I said, some context. how I got introduced, how we're going to adapt some of these outside experiences into Atlantic Canada. Go quickly over types of irrigation, because I see that Caitlin mentioned you've already gone through some of these series. I am the worst person for equipment in the universe. When something breaks on my farm, I tie things usually with rope until it breaks so much that I have to actually call somebody in. So everybody has their strengths and weaknesses. I will not be your equipment dude today. So if you have any questions for that, there are people that that's their specialty, but I do feel like I can offer something when it comes to fertility. I've worked with hydroponics. I've worked with lots of different systems that take fertility into account. So also, I'm going to talk a few things about the crop candidates that I think of in Nova Scotia. I'm clearly not going to cover all of them, but there are some there that we have experience with that really stick out. And then we'll get into the math, which will be the fertigation rates. And if we have time, which might not happen, we'll talk a little bit about my specialty in soils and tissues and how we can kind of fine tune systems using those analyses. So I see Sunny's here today. I just want to make sure I throw this picture out. This gentleman here on the left looking down, and the guy here again looking down, was my mentor, Wilfred Kelly. I know that Sunny had a very similar relationship with him. He was just a wealth of information and experience. And as this young man, when I started working with NutriAg, the first season, when we finally finished the very grueling Nova Scotia and PEI field season, Wilfred really said, we got to understand this fertigation and this irrigation issue. So he basically got a sponsor from our work to come in and say, okay, we can come in and fly to California and take a look at the most modern practices for fertigation and irrigation in the world. And I think Sunny and I both have the same perspective that, oh, we're so lucky here. We get to go see this place and we're going to come back and know everything there is to know about fertigation because they're experts. So whatever they're doing there, we're just going to adapt it here and we're going to blow everybody's mind when we return. So first things we started to notice is it's not going to be cheap. There's actually some pretty significant investments involved with this. So we might not need these gigantic drum filters because we're not pumping some of the very, very poor waters that they're dealing with in very, very deep wells, let's say in California. But again, there are going to still be some components of maintaining a drip system. And how do we adapt some of these technologies that might be smaller or reduced? You know, something like this might run 1,000 acres of grapes in one central area. So is there some options for smaller equipment? How do we work with that? After that period of time, I really realized quite quickly that you can't just take the program approach that you have in California, because what they say there is as soon as water stops coming from the sky, it stops coming from the sky. You know, the day almost that you're going to stop getting precipitation and you're going to have to start relying on irrigation. And that makes huge differences from us, where if you're expecting to put all your fertilizer, let's say, in the drip system and it rains the entire summer, well, you're going to be in a very difficult position, especially under plastic where you have no ability to change your fertility management. So this is an example of actually some organic strawberries and some fertigation systems that I saw in Mexico for Driscoll's. So you've probably seen Driscoll's berries at most of your grocery stores. But we've seen these types of things adapted, you know, to double drip systems on raised beds in plastic culture. It's something that I think is pretty exciting, and I know is being done in the Valley as well. Now, Caitlin was mentioning this, and I did throw this picture in last second, because your next session is on substrate growing. And I know down in the Valley, like Andy Vermeulen's got the big, you know, high tunnels going up, obviously, with hydroponic outdoor strawberries, but I really think this is something I've seen in areas and I find is really interesting. So this is Driscoll's again. This is their proprietary high bush blueberry varieties being planted out in soilless substrates where you have basically a drip emitter, if you look in the back here, in each one of these containers. So I was joking with Caitlin before, my soil up here is garbage on the North Shore, but we have a beautiful climate. In fact, we have more sunny days in some cases than the Valley does because a lot of that fog blows off the North Shore quite easily. But we have silt loams to, you know, almost pure silts up here. So this is something where I really think if Perennia starts branching out, and I always put a pitch out for the North Shore and everything, a lot of the focus in research is really in the Valley of Nova Scotia. And these types of things can really expand the footprint of agriculture into areas that are not classically thought of as having the right soil types, for instance, for high value vegetable and fruit production. But there are really interesting systems. And really, this is where fertigation counts the most, because here you're really talking about a modified hydroponic system outdoors. You're relying very little on the fertility in this substrate, and you're going to inject that as the crop requires it over time. And again, I've seen different systems. This is a micro sprinkler array that you would see. This is in Israel on avocados. And then again, just showing the amount of infrastructure that's involved in terms of piping and things like that when you have to rely on water all the time. So I'll also mention one more component before we really get into a few more details, and that's, be very careful when you're using water. You think, and in this area, we have in a certain way a perspective on water that's very fortunate, I guess. We're very lucky to have this abundance of water. But if we start to use this resource imprudently, and if we start to make mistakes in terms of the environmental impacts of using water inefficiently, public opinion on agriculture is going to change very, very quickly. And anybody who's been following the debate right now in Prince Edward Island around the moratorium on deep well digging, for instance, knows that they're pulling in experts from California to really describe the water situation here in Atlantic Canada. So much so that I've actually had to fight with people who tell me the best idea is for farmers to build their own desalination plant in order to actually irrigate with. Desalination plants are reserved for the highest deserts in the world. You're talking places like around LA, where you have, tens of millions of people in a desert area, or in places like Israel, where rainfall is basically non-existent. So I just want to make sure this is clear. Just because we think we have a limitless water resource, A, we don't, and B, we really need to be perceptive of how we interact with the public, because if not, you're very quickly going to have the same restrictions that they have on Prince Edward Island. And a lot of farmers lost a lot of money last year because they were not able to put irrigation in. I will also make note, when I was traveling, this is a picture of 500 acres of pomegranate that were abandoned because it was too expensive to water this block. Look at how huge these bushes are, rather. I would never see something like this anywhere outside of California, abandoning 1,000-acre blocks at a time on the left and right side of the field or of the road. And again, you see this huge fight between the general public, who generally doesn't have much exposure to agriculture, and the farmers themselves, which is really where you do not want to put yourself. Okay, no more doom and gloom. What I'm just saying here is, this is a picture of India as well. I want to just show you guys, this is not high tech anymore. So don't think of this as being restrictive. If small farmers in India who have around 0.9 or 0.8 hectares of land can set up micro sprinkler arrays and have beautiful beds of greens like that, you should be able to as well. On the right side, drip irrigation beds that you'll see again scattered throughout most of those arid areas. And lastly, I'm just going to throw this last one out. Don't always take what everybody says for granted. Like, don't take what an external person is going to tell you when it comes to what technology to use. So Israel is the king of drip. They're so proud of the contributions that they've made to agriculture globally through drip irrigation, and they should be. But if you go talk to any farmer that grows any significant amount of potatoes, not one of them uses drip irrigation. They all use micro sprinklers. So if a person's coming trying to sell you drip irrigation, you might want to be a little bit skeptical that that might not be the right approach. I'm not saying always throw everything out that anyone's telling you, but keep in mind that there are have different priorities overall. Okay, I'm going to talk about adapting things to the outside situation. This is my last picture for a little while, but this was when I realized I wasn't in quote unquote Kansas anymore, or for me, I wasn't in Malagash anymore. This is an almond tree that's been planted in a hole. And I live in Malagash, and if you come visit me, every one of my trees is on a hill. So we build things like hills to improve drainage in places like this. And we adapt irrigation and fertigation programs for places that do holes. So think about how much different water management is in a place that's digging a hole to catch water versus a place that's trying to push water off of their hill in the first place. So I mentioned this before. The major problem with irrigation and fertigation in Atlantic Canada, it just rains too much. And you might think I'm a complete fool for saying that, but it's really the reality. And one of the advantages, or several advantages, to living in the desert when you're a farmer is, like I said before, they say like God turns off a spigot and then there's no more rain anymore. And it just stops for 130 days. And then there's a block of time where hopefully we get some moisture from the air. So when it comes to that, if you're a farmer, you're going to invest in irrigation. It's a no-brainer. There's absolutely no way to grow a crop. And you'll see some pictures in a couple minutes where you can't even grow grass in the between rows of trees because there's just not even enough moisture to keep those grasses alive. Something that's completely different than the experience we deal with here in Atlantic Canada. The other thing is, I guess this will be my 12th season with Nutri-Ag, but it's about my 16th season as a farmer. I have yet to see one season that's the same as the previous 16 that I've seen. We have this crapshoot where we have no idea whether it's going to be a wet spring, a wet summer. Do I set up my drip system early? Do I set it up late? Honestly, I could tell you the best years that I set up my drip system, it always friggin' rained every single week. So those are the things that frustrate you because you set everything up, you put it in your top priority list, and then you look at it at the end of the year as a lost investment. I didn't even turn the thing on. So this is where it becomes very challenging. You have to take a position. You have to basically think of your upcoming season almost like the stock market. You don't really know. You have an idea that the trend is towards dry, the trend is towards hot, but don't be surprised if you spend $500,000 on infrastructure and then it rains for the next 2 seasons. I mentioned to you before that happened when they were looking at the pivot trials with McCain's in the 90s. And then they parked them all on the side and everybody joked about how stupid it was to irrigate your potatoes. And I guess people had the last laugh last year when they had the ability to do so. So this changes how we look at fertigation in Atlantic Canada when we compare it to something going on in California. So one of the things you saw, all those drum filters and everything, and you saw that big tank. So almost all of the nitrogen that's used in California is in the form of a liquid UAN. So here, it's very challenging to find large quantities of UAN because there's really not an infrastructure here towards fertigation. So you're going to see those challenges as well, is that certain technologies that are adapted to ship massive amounts of nitrogen by rail to the coast may not exist here when we're trying to look at the infrastructure for liquids. So I'm going to go through different types of fertigation products that you can look at. But if you think about that, dry fertilizer for us is how most of our fertilizer goes on in Atlantic Canada. I would say probably 95% of the fertilizer, and this is a guess, but I would say it's probably higher even, goes on as granular. And so if you start to think about that proportion compared to somebody in California, that's really going to change the dynamic completely. So if we know that we're not going to have every single opportunity to fertigate our crop that they would have in a desert either, we have to make a decision as to how much of our fertilizer are we going to put up front with our traditional granular programs, and then how much fertilizer do we have the potential to put in through our either our pivots or put in through drip. And this comes back to what I was just saying about how it's so much easier in a desert. Now I'm telling you, you need dry fertilizer infrastructure. So you need to learn how to spread, or you have to bring somebody in to spread fertilizer. And you need to have a fertigation, a Venturi system, an injector, a dosatron. So I'm pulling you in 2 different directions. You have to make 2 different investments. Whereas a person in California, they make one choice. They don't have to look at both of those. So they have lower costs even when it comes to that. This is why it's not so widely adopted, but there are certainly benefits to it as well. So finally, when you think about it, it's like taking a fungicide program from the desert and applying it to Atlantic Canada. Guess where most of the organic fruit is grown in North America? California. Yes, there are a lot of people that support that kind of agriculture in the West Coast, but there are in Florida too. And the reason is it doesn't rain in California. So I've seen grape growers that are conventional that use micronized sulfur as their fungicide things that here we would consider too low in terms of the activity to find a good control from. So you see, when you look at how we adapt a fertigation program, it's the same as if we try to adapt a fungicide program. Now, mind you, they've got a lot more insect pressure, you know, so again, we wouldn't take their insecticide programs either. Okay, we're going to move into a little bit of math here, but what I want to look at is just thinking about your normal fertilizer approach. So this would be, let's say, a high fertility program, maybe a crop like potatoes in a low P soil and a high K soil. My normal farmers might look at something like this: 180 units of nitrogen up front. They'll put some phosphorus down at planting, generally again banded, potassium, supplement magnesium, let's say again high K soil. If I wanted to adapt this or change it, and I'm thinking again about how I might not have the opportunity to come in and fertigate, I'm going to want to at least put half of my fertilizer up front. And Sonny, I know you're here, and I would like to know eventually what you think, because I know we talked about that before. Half the granular up front and then try to fertigate the remainder. Each crop's going to be different there. Certain nutrients. Notice I put all my phosphorus in the granular. Phosphorus is not an easily moved nutrient. So if I'm going to put a drip tape at the top of the soil and my root system is on a tree, let's say, and it's a foot underground, I should not expect that phosphorus to mobilize towards that root system as efficiently as a nutrient like nitrogen. So when we think about the mobility of these nutrients, we also take that into account as to which ones we're going to put in our fertigation programs. We already talked about this too. How do I know when I can water? You just told me I might not be able to water because it's too wet. How do I make that determination? So the easiest way is the ball method, which you could find online. You just basically squeeze a ball. I've put the resource here. So again, I'm hoping, as Caitlin was saying, this is recorded. So if anybody wants to look at this again, please take a look at this link from the Department of Agriculture in the United States. The reason I say that is I was only really wanting to show one set of pictures here. They actually will show you what the ribbons and what the balls will look like at different moisture contents in different soil types. So you don't have to just look at something like a sandy loam. You can look at something like a silt if you're somebody like myself. I see there was a question there.
Yeah, I think it's just a comment.
Okay.
Yeah, I can get to that later.
If we're looking, do you want to read the comment or we want to just proceed? It's okay.
Okay, so Joyce mentioned plastic culture 2 years, you don't have the option of granular.
Totally. Yeah. So there is a perfect example where you're going to really, even the second year especially, you're going to have to really rely on the nitrogen component of that. So phosphorus, to me, if you're going to be doing like a 2-in-2 band placement or a position that's adequate for that crop that you're looking at, you should have that residual phosphorus. Potassium, we'll talk about things like potassium thiosulfate and some complete nutrient options. Josh, I know you're organic, so I actually included some organic water solubles here. But basically those options like potassium sulfate, for instance, can be injected as well. So excellent point. Plastic culture in itself, we were talking about it before. Let's say it rains all summer. If I'm a potato farmer and I was going to fertigate nitrogen, I can just top dress, just call up somebody and they'll come and top dress some calcium nitrate or something. If the plastic is down, that option is no longer available to you. Another beauty of plastic, though, is if it keeps raining and raining and raining, it does wick off some of that water. So at least you're not getting oversaturation in the root zone. So again, I mentioned this site. Take a look at it, please, and then adapt your little ball method perhaps to your soil type. And that's the simplest way. For my scale, this is what I do. I don't have tensiometers or anything like that, but I only grow about an acre and a half of plastic culture a year. And I don't fertigate or irrigate my apples because we're on heavy soil. So some people might be tempted to look at these really, really cheap home gardener moisture meters. Please don't. They're very inaccurate. You stick them in the ground. You're creating this artificial environment as you insert it. And so then it's really not accurately showing you what a stabilized soil environment would be like anyway. I still think that your ball method or using your tactile sort of your fingers, for instance, is a better way to go about it. If you do start to look at other options, when you install like a tensiometer, for instance, again, take a look at different resources, most of them from California. good reason. And take a look at how they actually install these. So they make slurries, they use soil probes, they insert. They do that usually in the spring when they know they're not going to put much water on. And that means that a month from then, when they are considering irrigation, everything is sort of stabilized and you've got this equilibrium that you can truly look at what's happening where that root zone is in the plant. Again, there's depths to these tensiometers. So you want to have one at a shallow depth and another one more at a deeper point, and think about the crop you're growing. If you're growing a high density apple crop, a lot of these rootstocks are adapted towards going down rather than lateral. So really think about that when you're doing your management planning. And you can see here just an example of 3 different depths being looked at. Now, you can get these adapted now so that they're attached to either Wi-Fi or they're attached to some cell tower, and you can then get that information on your cell phone. So again, equipment, not the guy, but I've seen these in use in Prince Edward Island. You want to go super high tech, you can have weather stations, and this is an example from California, where basically you can see tensiometers positioned throughout the field, and actually it automatically turns the drip on and off based on the moisture level. Also, it's recording what they estimate the transpirational capacity of the leaves are, and then it'll match the capacity of transpiration to what they're putting into the ground. Notice I was talking about the difference between our areas. All they have to do is put one herbicide on in that between row, and that stays like that forever. So very different experience growing crops like this in basically what I would call a wasteland compared to the experience you would have here in Atlantic Canada. And this is the same in the Pacific Northwest. It's pretty much bare strips. When you're dealing with nuts, I mean, I'm not trying to judge these guys, but when you're dealing with nuts, they need to shake these and then scoop them off the ground. So they do need to keep like basically a strip there so that they don't pick up grass and all these other foreign materials when they do their harvest. So it is different than us. This is the most high tech I've ever seen, which is even cooler, same spot, but they actually attach these dendrometers, they're called, to the trunk. And here, this is a group from Israel, actually a group from Iran and Israel working in California. And they were actually tapping into each individual tree, and they showed me the graphs, and they could see the swelling of the wood when they would irrigate, and they would see like the kind of the tree get fat, and then they would see it contract as it was running out of moisture, and they would actually use that information to get the most accurate fertigation and irrigation schedule possible. If you look back to what I was saying before in terms of the cost of water in California, it's $1,000 per acre foot of water, US. So keep that in mind. This technology is expensive, but not to somebody in California, because it's way more expensive to waste water. And it's, as I said before, adapted to your region. It might be cheaper in the short term to waste water, but it's also bad for the environment. If that's something which you should care about that. But secondary, you're going to burn your public opinion if you don't pay attention to that. And then you're going to all be chasing, something pretty awful, in my opinion. Okay, now we're going to talk very briefly about the different types of systems that exist, because it does change how we fertigate and our management overall of fertility in our crops. So we've got sort of fixed solid set sprinklers, micro sprinklers, drip irrigation. We've got things that are mobile, so you got reels. And why this is different is because if you think about it, a sprinkler is putting all its water in one place in a period of time. If we're thinking about a gun, or we're thinking about a reel, that is transient. It's moving through the field. So what I'm starting to make you think about is there's only certain periods for injection based on certain types of irrigation here. So if we've never seen sprinklers, this is one of the more common ones I'll see in the valley, especially on lettuce and things like that. You see, basically you put out your pipes and you move these lines or the headers throughout the field, and you get a nice broad array of water, but all of that water goes in one period of cycle of time in one specific position. This is a kibbutz in Israel where they were doing applications with micro sprinklers. So here they've adapted drip in the orchard, but they do micro sprinkler wherever they're growing herbs and greens. In fact, micro sprinklers, in my opinion, is still one of the most efficient systems and does the least damage to leafy greens, for instance. Now, if we talk about drip, there's different types of drip. Almost everybody in California that's doing things like corn, cotton, they'll do subsurface drip. So they'll actually put this underground and they'll actually feed these pipes with some pressure enough that it doesn't collapse and it's able to deliver right in that root zone. This is for certain the most efficient method because if you think about the loss from evaporation, it's much lower than you're going to see in surface drip, for instance. And so here's an example of surface drip, very common around our area. You'd see like Charlie, Ketty, and Phil, they would use this type of a header, and then they'd have their drip lines going out under their plastic in their case. This is my son, Marty, getting a shower. Basically, the only way I can get them to actually get washed sometimes is to throw them under a pivot. But this is on one of our farmers on PEI that we work with. 34-inch centers here, and you're seeing that pivot central point as to where it turns. This set of tires will rip through some of your field, so you're going to lose some crop to the tires themselves, which is kind of one of the negatives I find of pivot. And then you'll also get on a corner field, the edges are not going to get, the corners are not going to get the water, and anything getting hit by the guns never work as well, in my opinion, as sprinklers on a pivot or a lateral reel. Which leads us to reel and gun. So here again, you've seen this system. This is a stock image, but basically you lay out your reel or your pipe and you pull it back here and you're using a gun. Here, once again, only certain parts of the field are getting water at certain parts in the cycle. So it's an injection thing that you're going to have to consider, and we're going to talk about that in a second. This is one of my preferred methods, to tell you the truth. I do like lateral reels. You don't get the problem where you're running over the crop. You have that ability to use these like micro sprinklers and low pressure sprinklers especially. And again, these are pulled in a similar way that we do with our reels. So this has been quite successful on Prince Edward Island, and then you can move this down the road to another field. So you have that adaptability. I will say that everybody that irrigates that I work with on the island does not sleep in the summertime. So if you want to see the most exhausted farmers I've worked with, other than dairy farmers, you're going to find people that are going to barely be able to keep their eyes open while you're talking. Maybe it's because I'm that boring, but realistically, they fall asleep while you're talking to them in the middle of the day. Now, this is a system I only recently came across because of putting this presentation together, and I actually think it's pretty cool. So this concept is you basically have that similar lateral reel system with the sprinklers, but you adapt it to create this drip bar, and you pull that through the field rather than pulling the sprinklers. So there you may have like 100 feet of line, and it's just basically dropping a drip style drip along. And so you're losing way less to evaporation at that point. The only thing I could see, everybody probably that would think of this in a center pivot would say this is the worst idea ever, because all of those lines tearing up the plants, I don't even like thinking about it. It would probably be a disaster. So, you know, even on a very, very like viney crop, let's say like a russet Burbank potato, for instance, this might be a very challenging thing to adapt. But I still thought it was cool. I've never seen one of these in action, but some of my farmers in Western Canada are considering these systems for potatoes. And last and least, because I leave the last for least in this case, or the least for last, is flood. If anyone does this on their farm, I will not be joining you to hang out and check it out. This is the dumbest way to possibly irrigate your crop. However, due to the politics of California, some people have ancestral water rights, and they do this still, despite their neighbor who has to pay $1,000 an acre foot for water, not doing it at all. So when we're talking about flood irrigation, for instance, it's definitely one of those things. You could see why we're wasting X amount of water. We have standing water sitting there evaporating, but you do kind of feel like you're in like a 14th century medieval town that's getting all their water by like an ancient cistern system. So there's that, at least. It does kind of look cool, but please don't do this. I saw there might have been a question there.
Just another comment that the system, I assume it's the last system that you were talking about, is being used by potato growers in southern Alberta.
Yeah, cool. So Harold Perry was one guy I was talking to that's considering that, and he's in Lethbridge as well. So definitely adaptable. But again, crop specific. All of these are crop specific. You know, we're going to talk about it in a sec, but it's a heck of a lot easier to pull a lateral reel, for instance, on potatoes than it is to put a drip every 30 inches, right? Or 36 inches, depending on your spacing. So we will, cover that a little bit. So I wanted to get back to this concept of efficiency. And again, I'm an environmentalist, so I implore you guys, and I know most farmers are, even if they don't think they are, because again, we have to be stewards of the land. We know that if we mess things up, it's going to affect us in the long term. So I just want to throw this up because Bayer actually had this, interestingly enough, even though Bayer, I don't think is really in fertigation. Maybe they are in irrigation in places that I'm unaware. But this whole concept that we're using 40% less water in drip irrigation, and again, this is probably Israelis that love this concept too, than we get in conventional or traditional methods. Well, this is what they call traditional, just so that you know. So I'm not saying that you don't want to consider drip. I love drip. I use drip. But sometimes people are going to try to adapt drip in places it doesn't belong to save what they think is 40% efficiency compared to a pivot, but it's really 40% efficiency compared to a flood system. So if you want to, I was surprised by this myself when I started looking up tables from California comparing efficiencies. If you look at a lateral move sprinkler, that's basically those reels that we saw that have micro sprinklers. Well, you're talking 87.5% to 95% efficiency on the drip in the comparison. That's a lot different than comparing my 95 in drip to a conventional furrow flood system. And so I just want to make sure everybody's aware. Drip is definitely the most efficient system, but it's only incrementally better than something like a lateral move sprinkler in your field. And a lot of times, and a lot of crops, a lateral move sprinkler is a heck of a lot easier to install and operate. Same thing I was mentioning before, on that same point, you're trying to get that extra 5% efficiency. Everybody in California needs that at, again, $1,000 for an acre foot. However, here, I'm not saying we want to waste water, but if you lose 3% to have a system that's actually better, or 5%, I don't think it's as dramatic here as it is in a place like an arid desert. Okay, so some candidate crops that we can take a look at in our area in terms of fertigation. Big one, tree fruit. A lot of the farmers I work with are either irrigating or fertigating their tree fruit crops. This gives you the opportunity to inject nutrients at very key times. Nurseries, everybody pretty much that has a tree nursery is taking a look at that, because you can't grow one of those really small trees without water. Lots of strawberry use. Potato, lots of irrigation in potato. I know we worked with Spurs there on some drip spots. So there are some people that have played with drip as well. Carrots and onions, almost every carrot and onion grower I work with are irrigating. And there are opportunities there, because we do applications of top dress of onions for nitrogen. So there may be opportunities to do that via fertigation instead. Just in case Phil's here, I threw in sweet potato for you. But again, squash is something I do a lot, and anything to do with plastic culture. I know Josh Olton here, you would be doing a lot of that stuff as well. High bush blueberries, obviously other similar bush types. I don't really like hascaps, but whatever, if they're in that grouping, go ahead, have fun. Grapes also, I would definitely consider that as well. Low bush, again, Hugh, I know you're dealing with low bush. You will see pivots in Maine, for instance, where they grow low bush blueberries. So I would probably not adapt the drip system necessarily, but there are opportunities in some areas for pivots as well.
Mm-hmm. Sebastian, we have a question from Josh, just to stop you a second.
Sure.
So he asked, is it easier to leach nutrient with drip?
I'm going to get into that, Josh. So yeah, that's a great point. The fact that you can use the same, I've been trying to lead up to that, but the fact that you can put nutrients into the third of your cycle, like the last third of your cycle in drip, does allow you to do things that you can't do necessarily with fertigation. However, I will also talk about how you can use things with pivots, for instance, and understanding your injection rates to minimize losses by putting in, let's say, lower concentrations more often. So I was mentioning PEI's potatoes. I am a Nova Scotian, but I spend more time on the island than I do in the valley because potatoes are my specialty. So I wanted to show you guys this because, as I mentioned before, we were in serious problems last year with moisture. And so if you might think, what's the big deal about getting irrigation? You know, some of these modern varieties, this is a yellow table variety, Columba, hard to see here, but the yield was 439 hundredweight at this time. Wasn't even finished yet. They ended up close to 500 and 214 in the dry land. So half the yield last year when you were irrigating some of these varieties over the other. Another one, Clearwater, known as a drought tolerant variety, 108 hundredweight in dry land, 202 in irrigated. And then reds, which have high table value, but can be finicky, 284 hundredweight when they were irrigated, 170 hundredweight when they were not. So these are dramatic differences that make significant changes to whether you can crop next year or not. Keep that in mind. These are not minor changes where it's needed. 1 year of cropping like this can pay for 10 years where it didn't work out for you. So as I mentioned before, you are going to have to take a calculated risk. We are not in an area where it's a decision like it is in an arid desert. But I'm just trying to show you what the upswing potential is for some of these decisions. All right, we're going to talk now a little bit more about management of the fertility. And so I'm going to throw a few things out there. First of all, beware of an acidophile. So if you're dealing with high bush blueberries, and it's not just blueberries that have this issue, be aware that not every nitrogen or not every crop takes the same source of nitrogen. So these are examples of the root system when a high bush blueberry is fed nitrate nitrogen compared to a high bush blueberry that's fed ammonium nitrogen. And if we look at why that's the case, it's because all of the bacteria that we expect to do this nitrification and moving ammonium to our nitrate are in much lower quantities in low pH soils than they are in high pH soils. So in these acidic environments of 4 pH or 3.5, these crops actually adapted themselves to pick up ammonium nitrogen preferentially. And so if you give a source of nitrate N, you're going to have problems. Okay, so we went through the list, and now I've just attached what I would kind of look at in terms of recommendations. I would definitely not throw a pivot in my trees. You're going to knock trees over and you're going to destroy your pivot. That's the easy one. But you have options in strawberries, whether you want to go with sprinklers, whether you want to go with drip, whether you're going to do plastic, whether you're not. Some of these you can go with almost all of the options. So really you have to figure out and adapt it to the size of your farm and also what your goals are. Now, adapting in terms of the requirement of moisture in your crop. So here's a good table from Alberta. I suggest you take a look at it. I forgot to include the link here, guys. My apologies, but I'll send it on if required. Then we're going to focus in on potatoes. And why is because I really want to show you too is that each one of these crops is going to have a different timing of demand for this water. And we talked about it before. Each one of these crops, you could find another curve like this for nitrogen, for instance, and it may not overlap with this curve. And if you can't apply moisture and fertigation early on because the crop requirements are low and you're getting moisture from the air, you are in big trouble for supplying nitrogen to that crop. So make sure that you also take a look at the nitrogen uptake curves for your given crop and make sure that they overlap with the water usage curves, because otherwise you're going to have limited opportunities if you get precipitation. If you're dealing with something like plastic culture, like Josh was mentioning before, there you end up evaporating from the plant a lot of moisture in these big stress period or big peak periods of water requirement. And there, even if it's raining, you can still inject in that system. So you really, this is why there's not a one size fits all. It really depends as to what you're doing and all the considerations in your system. All right, everybody's favorite, mathematics. So it's funny because if you ask most agronomists out around here, you know, how many square feet is there in an acre? They'll tell you 43,560 square feet. It's like off the top of your head. You know, there's 208.7 feet by 208.7 feet, and that makes your square acre. Luckily, when you're metric, 100 by 100, and you're at 10,000, everybody loves metric. Regardless, you ask somebody in California, how many gallons are in an acre inch, they are going to rhyme it off as quickly as I just did the area of an acre. If you ask 9 out of 10 agronomists, I would say 99 out of 100 agronomists in Atlantic Canada, how many gallons or liters are there in an acre inch, they are going to be completely unable to answer you. So when we're taking a look at these application rates, we need to really think about what we're trying to do and how much water we're actually trying to put on in these situations. So the reason I really think this is important to contextualize for people, first of all, you can match the size of your pivot. How many gallons per minute am I injecting? And then it's going to give me this many acres at X amount of moisture. So in this case, 1.8 acre inches per hour. Okay, well, the reel can turn fast or slow. So you can either put this 1.8 inches on an acre, or you can spread it over 5 acres and still do it in the same amount of time. You just change the speed of your pivot, basically. Why I like to mention this, though, is last year in the drought, farmers were asking me, should I go and get my sprayer and just take out the nozzles and just water my crop with my sprayer? Not unless you can put down 102,000 liters on an acre with your sprayer, and your normal sprayer is going to be putting down like 3,000. So you could spend the entire day making yourself feel better, or you can go to the beach with your family, enjoy some time together, because it's going to be about as useful to your crop as watering it with an irrigation system. So this is, again, context to what all these things are looking at. So if I'm looking at an acre inch of water, you're going to hate me for this today, but I'm going to be going back and forth between imperial and metric. It's because some people use both, and then I am adapted to using all of them at once. So anyway, if we're looking at an acre inch of water here, we're talking about 102,000 liters of water. And again, that's a lot of water to put down on an acre at one time, but it gives you a pretty beautiful appreciation for how lucky we are when we get 50 mils of rain sometimes when we need it. Imagine trying to go out and supply that to your crop everywhere. Okay, so we'll talk about fertigation rates now as they apply to pivots. So if we zoom in on one of these pivots, the first time I ever saw one was actually flying over in an airplane, and I thought, oh my God, the aliens are here. There's crop circles everywhere. Of course, I'm a complete fool living in an area where it gets water all the time. This is very normal in the rest of the world, but you see these beautiful green circles surrounded by desert. Now we're going to zoom in on one to try to identify what we were talking about before, and what Josh was actually mentioning with nitrogen management is think about what we're doing with a pivot. So if we looked at this, there would be a big bar here with all of our sprinklers, and this pivot's turning, and it's going in this big loop, and it comes back to where it started, okay? What that means is if I want to inject fertilizer, I have to inject it in the entire turn. If we think about how we've been taught to think about drip irrigation, for instance, in drip, we've learned that we should be applying most of the fertility in the last third, let's say, of a cycle. And we'll go through that as well later on. But that changes how much nitrogen you could put down in the first place, but also the efficiency of the nitrogen you're going to be applying. If I overwater and I'm fertigating my crop, and that water is going to get beyond the root system of my plant, I am going to inherently contaminate my water table with the nitrogen that was meant for my crop. So pivot has that limitation. And one of the best ways we can reduce that is by understanding not just how much nitrogen we want to put on per acre, but also what the concentration of that nitrogen is in our injection system to begin with. So I'm going to talk about different forms of fertilizers here today, some of which I don't sell in any way, other which I will talk about some of our products later on. So these are things that you can find everywhere in the West Coast, but UAN, it's making its way here for corn growers, but it's still not as common as you would see in places that rely on fertigation. So I'm going to pick on, I think, UAN 28 here today, because that's the most common form. There is UAN 32, which is more concentrated, but it's a little bit trickier to get a hold of and is not typically as stable. You can also make your own urea solution. So if you really want to get tech grade urea and dissolve it and all those things, give her. But we're going to talk about the easier ones to work with here today to keep things a little bit more relevant. Each one of these has a different solubility as well, but these are all talking about liquids here. So these are all solutions that we can inject. UAN is 28% N, and it's a liquid form. So if you stick your little Venturi injector in there, you can just suck it up right from the tote or right from your vat. You don't have to worry about adding water. So we're going to go look at a theoretical application rate. I mentioned before, let's say I was a potato farmer and I put 90 units of N up front, like I was showing in that earlier one. And now I want to do one of my fertigation passes to top dress my nitrogen an extra 30 units. So if I selected that UAN 28, you see from the table that for every gallon of UAN, you get 3 pounds of nitrogen. So again, if you prefer metric, for every liter of UAN, you get 0.36 kilos of nitrogen. So if I take a normal injection rate, which a lot of farmers look at, 10 gallons per acre, you're looking at about 93.4 liters, which will end up giving me that 30 pounds of nitrogen that I'm shooting for here. Because again, 10 times 3 equals 30. So if I'm looking at how to apply that though, again, I can't just put pure UAN. I will burn my plant if I put pure UAN. So I think to myself, okay, Sebastian, I'm going to put on 1/2 inch today. So can I put this UAN of 10 gallons with 1/2 inch? Of course you can. And I'll tell you the dilution rate or the injected rate is about 1 to 1,357. So right off the bat, anybody with like a common Venturi system, you typically cannot go this fine. So if you're going to want to go at this kind of injection rate, you're going to need something very specific, like a dosatron, for instance, where you can set the rate digitally or with some other injection system. If you're going to use passive injection like a Venturi, 1 to 16 is a typical injection rate. So we'll talk about that later on. But that still brings to mind or brings to the forefront that if you're going to be making these decisions, you have a certain equipment cost associated with it. Now, I told you, you can inject at 1 to 1,357.7. However, you're going to have a final injection concentration of nitrogen of 265 parts per million. Nitrogen is the most likely nutrient to burn our crop here in these systems, okay? And what I always like to use as a rule of thumb is around 150 parts per million. And this is something that they're looking at in California. It's definitely not worked out yet exactly the ideal injection concentrations. But why is this important? Or why do I choose 150? It's because I've worked with hydroponics quite extensively. And I know, for instance, in deep water culture where you have roots submerged directly in a nutrient solution, that even a baby root is fine at 150 parts per million nitrogen. I've done it enough times to know and be confident that at least at that concentration, I'm not going to burn anyone's crop. So luckily, I burn my own crops before I burn your crops, guys. But the reality is, if we could take that same information, we could actually use it and look at it 2 different ways. So I'm too high here, indicated here by my red, and I want to get, maybe lower, less than 150 parts per million. So one of my options is just increase the water. Okay, you might have noticed there a second ago, I'm talking about 1/2 inch of water per acre. Okay, do the exact same amount of UAN, but put it over 1 inch. And clearly that's going to change your injection ratio. So now I'm injecting at 1/679, let's say, compared to that 1/1358 that I was looking at a second ago. You don't have to go that route. And in fact, you might say, oh, shoot, Sebastian, it rained and I still need to get this nitrogen on. So what are my options? I can only really afford 1/2 inch of water on this field or I'm going to get drowned out. That's where you would pull back your UAN in this consideration. So go from your 10 gallons per acre of UAN and go down to 5. And just know that if I'm putting on, it's almost a 1 to 1 in this, or 10 to 1, basically. For every 1/2 inch I can put on 5 gallons of UAN within this system. So what I do when I'm looking at these things, it's really all about trying to hit this safe injection rate where I'm not going to burn things. Same again when we're talking about nitrogen management. If I inject a lower concentration of nitrogen, something that I know plant roots can very quickly take up, then I have less likelihood of having that nitrogen move its way through and past the root zone into my waterway. Because now the next time I come in, I can put another little supplemental nitrogen. So this is why chasing a lower concentration is very helpful. It helps us protect our plant roots and protect us from burning the crop, but it also protects our nitrogen from making its way where we don't want it in our groundwater and basically wasting the money that we're applying in this nitrogen fertilizer in the first place. So I mentioned this before. What we're talking about is this old conventional method, comparing it to injecting 30 units of N each time, but you just saw how hard that could be. So maybe you have to adapt it and start thinking about it like this. After I get my 90 on, I'm going to take every fertigation window I have available to me and supplement small amounts, like spoon feeding your crop and adding 15 units of N maybe every 2 weeks during my production system. This is grossly simplified, guys, because there's too many crops to cover in one day, okay? But keep in mind, as we just discussed, there's a water curve. There's also a nutrient curve for many of these crops. So make sure if you're going to do this late season supplemental nitrogen, you're not doing it on a pumpkin crop that's going to give you a bunch of flush of vegetative growth at the expense of fruit development. So you have to also learn to match your actual given crop with what you're trying to do from a fertigation perspective. And that will require, somebody might tell you they know how to do that in your field, but only people that know how to do that in your field will be you. Somebody might come and be able to help you, and together you can figure it out, but farmers know more about their fields than anybody else. Okay, so we moved away from the limitations that we have with a lateral pull, and we moved away from the limitations that we would have with a pivot system, that's center pivot. What we get here when we're talking about drip is that we have one zone where we're managing, and we can actually consistently and constantly put that moisture in that given zone before going and on to another zone. Okay, so how much water is required for an hour of drip irrigation? That is not a simple answer. There are many different spacings that you're going to deal with based on what crop you're growing. So I'm going to give you 4 examples here today, and we're going to look at a table here together and also kind of look at how big of a pond you might need and start thinking about those components as well. So if you think about something like Honeycrisp apples, I'm going to go with a pretty wide row spacing for these days. We're down probably to 12 or 10 in some cases, but let's say we have 14 feet between row. And again, I mentioned before, each row in an acre is about 208.7 feet long. You make that multiplication, and on an acre of Honeycrisp, you have around 3,100 linear feet of drip. Now, if I go to Muscat grapes, my favorite variety here in Nova Scotia, you're going to actually get down to 10-foot spacings, maybe even 8 in some cases. And now you're seeing that spacing change is going to affect how many linear feet I have in my acre. And since drip systems are all based on pressurized systems that are regulated and the drip emitting a specific volume per emitter, the length of your drip system is going to be completely correlated to the moisture that you can provide per acre in that unit. My most common method is on winter squash. So all of my squash and pumpkins are under drip, under plastic. And again, here you can see I'm more than double what I saw on the apples. And I'm a little bit more than 50% on what I saw there with the grapes. If I'm a complete crazy person and I want to do sweet corn that way, and I think almost everybody in the valley that's doing sweet corn is using either a gun or lateral, I would be looking at 1,400 linear feet per acre, and that's a non-permanent crop. So I'm going to be ripping that up the subsequent year. So you got to think about all those components. That's why I wanted to kind of throw them out here. When we sit and put them one against the other, again, you can see that the amount of volume applied per acre is 1-to-1 correlation with the row spacing you're going to have in your system. So if I look at, in this case, 1 hour in liters per acre, actually, let's go liters per hectare to be fun today. In liters per hectare, you'd be looking at 12,000 liters on an acre of Honeycrisp and 60,000 on an acre of sweet corn. So really, you're also telling yourself, I got to run this probably 4 times less time than I do this in order to get the same control, which actually might mean I need less of a filtration system here than I do here, because each one of my emitters here is permanent. And on top of that, it's going to be used for much longer periods of time than what I see with a non-permanent crop. I also threw out, if I took an acre pond, so again, 208.7 by 208.7 feet at 15-foot depth, we have about 18,000 liters of water, almost 19,000. And this is as many acre hours as you could expect. So if you were to figure out this amount of volume this kind of a pond, you can now start to figure out how big of a pond do I need for my 30-acre block of apple trees? How big of a block do I need for my 50-acre block of grapes or squash or something along those lines? Or in my case, how tiny of a pond do I possibly need for this 1 acre of crop that I grow for fun?
Sebastian,
Yep.
what PSI are you talking about for those application?
So in terms of those applications, I think it was the 12 PSI, your typical like low pressure stabilized emitter rate, but I would have to go back and see. I do have the table or the reference, so I can go back and let you guys know what that was calculated on. It's the same. Again, I did the math there. I didn't want to go through it too much, but it's the same calculation. Actually, it's a good point. Right here. So it's 100 feet of row was putting out 0.74 gallons per minute theoretically with this drip system. This is the one I used to make the calculation. If you find you have a different drip system, just stop here and multiply this value or your new value for your emitters by this value, because the linear foot will stay the same. And then you'll have a new set of values here. And from that, you can work with it to modify. But great question.
Okay, thanks. So that's a question asked by Josh. So if you want to confirm with Sebastian, you guys can contact afterwards. Thanks, Sebastian.
No problem. So if we're looking at fertigation rates here, let's say we're looking at something like Honeycrisp. Again, we can look at different scenarios. 1 hour run, what we were looking at before when we were kind of comparing what Honeycrisp apples would put out in an hour, talking about 5,000 liters of water per acre in this case. But once again, if I wanted to apply 15 units of N, which is a decent, top dress for apples, let's say, questionable. I'm not going to get into the argument as to when to apply that, but let's just say you want to put 15 N on your Honeycrisp crop. If I actually try to do that in a 1 hour run, notice how much higher I am than that ideal 150 parts per million. Yeah, I can do it, but I may start causing damage to my crop. And you will never, on a tree like an apple that's fully mature, you're not going to kill it. You're probably not even going to notice the damage. But notice those pictures I showed of root systems. You certainly want a nice white, healthy root system, not something that's dying because it was burnt by nitrogen. So if I wanted to look at that, I would actually have to change my plans. I would say, actually, my desired injection ratio minimum is 1 to 2,373. And that means I need to run this water for 8.6 hours if I want to get that 15N applied using UAN. And so that would give me my final concentration of 150 parts per million, which I know for sure in all the systems I've worked with will not burn your plant roots. Okay, we completely ignored soil type in this equation. So let's keep that in mind as well. This is a picture just showing you after about 10 hours after irrigation on 3 different soil types using the same amount of water, a 1.5 liter per emitter discharge per hour. And notice here, sandy loam soils, basically you have a really nice transmission from an area of high concentration where the emitter is that makes its way nicely down towards the root system. You will notice, however, the emitter is here. There is very little water above the emitter. Deal with my kind of soil, a silt loam, for instance, I've got as much water above my emitter as I have below my emitter. So there you have the capillary action of the soil that's going to pull moisture up. And this is something Sunny and I have actually talked about before, whereas in my area, lots of people with heavy soils will be like, oh, I don't need to water. Oh, I don't need to water. Don't worry, it's still wet. And then when I need to water, I got to run the damn thing for 3 weeks because it takes so long to resaturate that soil. So it really makes more sense to just consistently keep my soil moisture at a good, adequate level than to assume that because I'm in a heavy soil, I got to wait until I'm in the cracking drought before I actually do something about it. So this is looking at, again, the distribution of water specifically, but we're going to talk about nitrogen here as well. So sorry, before we get to nitrogen, I'll mention this. This is also, you might say, okay, if I'm getting all my water getting lost here in my sandy loam, maybe I'm just going to put a lower speed emitter and get less discharge per unit time. And so here we're looking at 3 different discharge fluxes, 1 liter per hour, 1.5 liter per hour, and 2 liters per hour. Now, this is after the 5th irrigation event, so we're not talking about each individual event. And this is, again, 14 days after the final application. But notice, regardless of what type of pattern I took with my drip system, I have a very, very similar picture in all these different soil types. So changing your emitter speed in an effort to change the efficiency of movement, when it comes to something like drip, it doesn't seem to be as effective as you might expect, because this was surprising when I looked at it. All right, now we're going to talk about nitrogen. This is urea applications in fertigation. And what we're looking at here is the distribution of urea over time over that soil profile. So here we're looking at just the granule that was applied. This is the region that was applied. And then over time, you see the breakdown of urea. So you have 4 days, 7.6 days, and 11.1 days. So urea basically here, when you see it moving, sorry, I shouldn't have said breakdown, you're seeing the mobilization of urea from one location to another. Notice it is actually moving up through capillary action again, which is quite interesting as to we were describing before. So the highest concentration is seen here actually above the emitter. But most of our urea in soil, and we looked at this graph before when we were talking about blueberries, but in a non-acidic environment, so a good pH of, let's say, 6.5, urea breaks down into ammonium, and then ammonium breaks down into nitrate. And most plants that are not acidophiles actually prefer to take up nitrate as a form of nitrogen. There's a lot of argument even there. In potatoes, ammonium nitrate will actually, or ammonium forms of nitrogen rather, will preferentially push vegetative growth. And if you look at something like nitrate in hydroponics, it pushes more reproductive growth. So plants have also adapted sort of their physiological responses to different nitrogen, but we're not going to get in the weeds about that here today. It's another topic for another 90 minutes. So here, as I mentioned, that urea that was applied will break down first into ammonium. So when I'm looking here at ammonium, it's not because we applied ammonium, it's because we applied urea, and we're looking at how that ammonium is then released, or how that urea first breaks down and releases ammonium first. So you're going to see this nice little pulse here around the emitter. And again, over time, after that 3-day cycle, you're going to see the concentration stays roughly the same. You're not really getting much ammonium production that's, you get an equilibrium, let's say here, of ammonium production. And then you see the subsequent conversion to nitrate. So that ammonium will then get broken down by a microbe, and you'll actually get a gradient of nitrate. And so here you see, this is the problem with leaching. Notice here we almost have like a bubble forming, and then we get a region of high concentration, and then almost like the bubble popped. And here we have this big pulse of nitrate that's rapidly moving outside of my root zone, which is where I do not want that nitrogen going. So keep in mind that even if I'm applying something like urea, it's going to break down into nitrate, and that nitrate is going to be subsequently, it can potentially leach. So all of these things are really to hammer home the point that we need to minimize nitrogen leaching. And so it's harder when we talked about pivots, because with pivots, again, everything's going on at once. So the only rule, or the only way we can do that there, is by trying to follow that 150 parts per million rule of thumb. But when we're looking at something like drip, you can do split applications to reduce, you can do timing application changes that you cannot do in pivot to reduce the overall negative effects of nitrogen application. So kind of wanted to show this because they were looking at when you apply your nitrogen in the drip cycle. So here we're looking at, imagine putting it in the middle of my irrigation cycle. So not at the start, I want to get the soil a little bit moist first, but halfway through or a third of the way through, I inject, and now I'm going to 2/3 of the way through, and I turn off my injection, and the rest is going in just water. And notice here what happens. You have your nice concentration zone. Again, you're seeing that mobilization of the nutrient, but this is what I'm talking about with that bubble pop. You're almost seeing that nice banded color zone pop, and all of a sudden you get that nitrogen moving well beyond where it can be taken up by our given crop. This is completely different than if you put it in at the end of your irrigation cycle. And this is the recommendation. I know when you guys at Perennia, you had the Hort conference, I think 3 years ago, somebody came from Ontario to talk about fertigating strawberries, and they were talking the same thing. Applying your fertility at the last third of your cycle. And notice here, you have a very nice consistent concentration of a nutrient. You're not getting that bubbling and popping effect here. Again, that you get that separation point, and then you're seeing your nitrogen move past your root zone. You're really getting it in the area where you want that nitrogen to stay. So what does the end of the cycle mean? I already ruined that question, but really the California rule of thumb is in the last 1/3 of your irrigation cycle, that's the best time to be adding your nitrogen. And they're moving again more and more to this idea because they love saving water and they would love to inject most of their nitrogen in a very narrow block of water. But the reality is they're now having to increase water use in order to accommodate the lack of burn when we do these fertigation rates. So let's take that fertigation sort of rate that we had before. We're going to adapt it to winter squash. So again, now we're talking more linear feet overall of production. And I know I put down about 12,190 liters per hour in a run. So if I'm going to do a 3-hour run, my last third will be 1/3 of that, which again, 1/3 of 3 times that, which is the same number. So you would have about 12,190 liters in the last 60 minutes of a 180 minute run. So if I take that target concentration rate of 150 parts per million, so now I'm doing it backwards in order to tell me what's the maximum I can put on, rather than me telling the system how much I want to put on, I will take 150 parts per million as my theoretical maximum. I figure out how much water I'm actually getting. I make a calculation, and it's telling me in my winter squash, if I want to put it on safely in the last 1/3 of my 3-hour run, I can put about 4 pounds per acre of nitrogen in this system. If I want to increase that number, I only have the option of increasing the amount of irrigation or splitting it and doing it in my subsequent run a little bit more as well, rather than trying to focus it on in one application. Okay, so now you're seeing that this original fertility plan, again, I put less nitrogen here because we're dealing with squashes. So maybe a squash, you would generally put 120 units and you might want to put 60 and then a little bit of subsequent applications later on. You actually may want to look at something more like this, which is you're upfront and then spoon feeding every single time in season that you're putting on some application. You throw a little bit of nitrogen with it. Squash was probably the worst example of a crop to do that with, mind you, because as I mentioned before, you may encourage vegetative growth by doing so. But that's why you want to match your nitrogen crop demands to what you're doing with your fertigation schedule. Sweet corn loves nitrogen. It loves it late. So something like this, if you were crazy enough to do drip sweet corn, might be better adapted there than you're going to see when you're looking at something like a squash, where you're going to push the type of growth you may not want. All right, so we talked about nitrogen only, but that's not the only approach that you can take. So you can actually fertigate your potassium as well. So here's a good example. This is one of the feeds we use in Ontario. We call it specialty feed veg A. You've got a 3-7-16, a couple micronutrients and secondaries, a lot of magnesium, so very helpful here in Atlantic Canada. And then you've got a nitrogen source similar to calcium nitrate that's going on. So you get your calcium, you get your nitrogen, you get magnesium, sulfur, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, etc. So if I want to make those same calculations we were just looking at to figure out how much units of what am I putting on, I'm going to throw out a few warnings to everyone. Not only are we foolish in that we don't use the metric system, as I've made very obvious here today, we also are foolish in that in North America, we use P2O5 as a metric for phosphorus. This is very dumb, but we still do it. K2O instead of potassium when we talk about K. In fact, these things don't exist in the soil. They're actually artifacts of old sampling systems, but regardless, they look higher than the other versions, so we've kept them. Realistically, 7% P2O5 is actually less phosphorus. So if we want to look, I thought I actually did the conversion rate for everybody, but if you take 7% and divide it by 2.29, now you're going to actually get the true p-value. If you take 16% and divide it by 1.2, you get the true k value. And all of this, you're going to start looking probably up resources for fertigation through hydroponic systems. They always use P and K. If you're going to work with European numbers, they always use P and K. Hilariously enough, Europe uses MGO because they just had to be different. And then that screws everybody up along the way. All I'm getting at is it's not as simple as imperial and metric. You also need to know what you're looking at from conversion factors. Regardless, a 3% product is 30 parts per million, okay? So every time you have 1%, think of it as 10,000 parts per million. The best way to, if you forget that, remember 100% is going to be 1 million parts per million, meaning that it's every one of the parts per million. So if I think of 10%, it should be easy. I take a million and I divide it by 10, and now I have 100,000 parts per million. So whenever you're working with these systems, again, it's very, very easy as a conversion from percent to parts per million, unless you deal with phosphorus and potassium. There's an extra treat for you in the math there. So if I was actually trying to look at my phosphorus rate, so I wanted to look at the max rate for phosphorus applications. In hydroponics, it is generally 50 parts per million P, not P2O5. So this is a very safe rate that you can use. If we're looking at application rates here, again, we start at that 31,050 parts per million, which is coming here from P2O5, divided by 50, you get your conversion rate, and you know how much P and K you're putting on here. Or sorry, in this case, P you're putting on, and you have N and K coming along for the ride. Again, we know this is where sometimes you have an A and B solution. We know that most of the nitrogen is in this solution. So make sure if you have 2 nitrogen sources, use the other one first and then top up with your second source. So there I got some of my nitrogen, 48 from specialty feed A. I want 150, so I subtract 150 or 48 from 150. Now I only want 102 from the second product. And again, I can do the conversion rates, and I know how much of this material, 1 kilo in 1,372 liters of water, that I'm looking at. This will also come with calcium along the way. So if I do this, I know I want around 1 kilo every 621 liters of water for one, and about 1 kilo in every 1,372 kilos or liters of water in the other. And you might say, well, what the heck? Those two numbers are not the same. What am I going to do? Don't worry, we're going to get to that. So we talked about here water solubles. I'm going to throw this table up just so that you know, you can look this up. It's available in a lot of fertigation and a lot of irrigation sources. It will tell you not only the concentration of these elements or these salts, but also how soluble it is. And you're going to have to keep that in mind, because even though I might want to put X amount of nutrient into a stock tank, if I put too much, it's going to precipitate and it'll be sitting at the bottom. And it'll either inject all at once as a very, very concentrated salt, or it will be sitting at the bottom at the end of your cycle, and which means it's not in your field where you want it. So we're going to think here now about stock tanks. You actually need to have, in a lot of cases, especially if you're going to have this sitting around, a stock A and a stock B. And in this case, if you have a blue barrel, normal 2,000 liters of water, and I want this typical 1 kilo in 620 liters of water, then I know I can dissolve about 9.8 kilograms of this specialty feed A in 200 liters of water. And again, a different concentration here, 4.4 kilos in the same 200 liters of water. And now I can inject the two of them with the same system without having to worry about changing the injection rate, because I've made it so the concentration of one is higher than the concentration of the other, but the injection is going to be fine. So here, this is where our desired injection rate, if we do this kind of application of 9.8 kilos in 200 and 4.4 kilos in 200, I would end up applying 4 pounds of N, 1.5 pounds of P2O5, 3.4 of K2O, 1.8 calcium, 1.9 sulfur, etc. Notice 1 in 30. Most emitters, as I mentioned, are not 1 in 30. They're 1 in 16. If a passive Venturi system is often 1 in 16, or that's how it's originally set. You don't have to panic. Just change the water volume of your stock tanks accordingly. So divide 30 by 16 and then divide the same basic factor of 200 to 1 to, and you'll figure out basically how much water volume you need. So we can change the injection rates, we can change the concentrations. You have a lot of ability when you make a stock tank to either make it really strong and you're injecting it at a low rate, or making it really dilute and you're injecting it at a high rate. Of course, the higher the lower the dilution, you're going to end up needing a bigger tank. So this is all going to factor in as to what equipment purchases you want to make. And I threw this one in because I'm assuming somebody's thinking this. You guys are being so friggin' annoying. Why would you not put these two materials into one? It's not that we can't, or it's not that we don't want to, it's that we can't. If you take stock A and stock B, this is a scenario where you want it sitting around so you go and turn on the system and it's ready to go. If you're going to prepare what you inject today, you can look at systems like this where you combine the two stocks together in one. But this is what you're trying to avoid. The reason why there is a and B in every single fertilizer in the world is because in a complete fertilizer mix, you want calcium. And in a complete fertilizer mix, you want phosphorus. And this is what happens when you mix calcium and phosphorus at a neutral pH. And this will plug up every one of your emitters. In fact, you might say, well, how long does it take to dissolve? It takes as long as bone, because bone is made of calcium phosphate. So realistically here, you're building bones in your stock tanks if you don't consider the fact that these two things react. Yes, you can drop the pH of your stock tank and it will keep them from reacting with one another, but you probably don't want to inject a pH of 1.5 into your system either. So this is really important when you think about plugging emitters, thinking about things like if you have two stock tanks and they're separate, that's a beautiful thing because you can go back to it, agitate it, and not be concerned about tie-up. I have a tank out back that I mixed up both in one. It started to rain. You might say, well, fertilizer doesn't go bad. I'm going to have to dump that next year. I'm going to have to put it in a place where I don't care much about phosphorus anyway. I could take advantage of some of the nitrogen maybe, but most of my phosphorus in that system is going to be, basically a film of bone at the bottom of the systems. So very simple kind of thing here is you can move towards a complete liquid. So we do have these new hydroponic liquids that we're working on where you can just straight up inject about 10 liters of this product to get a pound of nitrogen. So yes, it is more costly. It's going to be definitely for higher value crops, but this is something you could just take a tote, throw it out next to your injector and just inject at a pretty safe rate the entire time. This also includes all the micro and macronutrients required for crop production. So it's a full host nutrient system. So we have that available. If you're like me, 1 acre, this is a lot of work and a lot of math to do 1 acre. It's sometimes just easier to use a premix, but I leave that to everybody to make their own choice. I know I'm getting close to time here, but I will mention organic. This is a revolution as far as I'm concerned. So I've always, when I started in agriculture, I started working in organic agriculture. I actually did my master's on compost teas with asparagus. But interestingly enough, one of the biggest nutrients that were limiting us was phosphorus. We have finally found an organically certified water-soluble phosphorus source. So we have this 6-7-10 fully water-soluble. You see, even in a tank here, a stock, it's 20% weight by water. So you can have a very concentrated high P starter now, even in organic agriculture. You mix that with your 1201s, which are again water-soluble soy isolates. And now you have an NPK fertigation option in organic agriculture, whereas only a couple years ago, you could put phosphorus in as rock phosphate, for instance. We had a product with it, but you were eventually going to plug your emitter because rock phosphate is calcium phosphate, the same bones we were talking about before. Last I'm going to mention is sulfate of potash. I don't sell sulfate of potash, so I'm not trying to promote it here, other than the fact that I know it works quite well on apples. Honeycrisp disorder, we've seen a lot of that in the valley. I did a trial last year, interestingly enough, and I saw a massive reduction where we used SOP. If you look at nitrogen curves and the response in yield to many different crops, you're going to see that there's a bunch of noise in these types of data. So just keep in mind, we spent a lot of time talking about nitrogen here today, but things are limiting our crops other than just N, P, and K. So I spent a lot of time on N today, but it's not like I don't spend a lot of time on other things. To make that dramatically clear, this is a study that was done on lettuce in Brazil, and they actually showed that as you increase the nitrogen rate of a high nitrogen crop like lettuce, if we include a micronutrient like molybdenum, we actually change the nitrogen response curve. So this crop is A, more tolerant to more nitrogen, and B, had a higher yield when nitrogen was supplied with molybdenum than when a lower rate of nitrogen was applied alone. So this is showing that all these micronutrients are really involved in things like nitrogen use efficiency. And you could put all the nitrogen in the world that you want down. And if you're not taking care of secondary and micronutrients, you're not going to see a yield response to that applied product or given fertilizer. I'm not going to belabor this because we're running out of time. This is not just for almonds. This is a similar thing we see in strawberries, and it's a similar thing we see in many different crops. So I know I've gone a little over. Sorry for that, but if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to chat about it more. Again, we have different options for fertigation at Nutri-Ag, but most of our work is really in foliar technology. So I can help steer you in the right direction, but I certainly won't be able to make everybody's fertilizer plans basically for the year kind of thing.
Perfect. So I don't see any question in the chat or Q&A. So Caitlin, do you have any question?
No, I just trying to take it all in, and I'm definitely going to have to go back and review this one later. But no, this was really fantastic, and I think we've all learned a lot here today. If anybody does have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Hugh and my contact information is here on this slide. And then please join us for our next session, which will be Tuesday, March 23rd at 11 a.m. till 12:30. And it will be on making the switch to soilless substrate. And that will be with our protected crop specialist, Talia.
Sorry, we have a last minute question. If you don't want to answer, Sebastian.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So Josh asked, what do you do if rain when fertigation times comes?
No, that's exactly the point. I wish I had an answer for you. You put a tarp over your field, I guess, which you do with plastic culture, right? But I mean, that's the reality. You don't have that control here, which is what makes it so much more challenging in areas. So I would basically say, like, don't over leverage yourself expecting to be able to have that opportunity. And it depends on your crop and your coverage. If you're going to be putting up a high tunnel, like they got the berries there at Dyke View's Vital Berry or whatever, you know, there you have way more control. You're basically creating a California situation in your field, which has a lot of benefits to it.
Yeah, no, as you said, like in that desert system, it's just, you can just depend on what you're doing so much more. And we've got a lot of factors we have to play with here.
And that was exactly when Sonny and I went. I mean, when I went to California the first time, I was like, I thought I was going to see the best farmers in the world. I almost saw the opposite, because if you had a field that was struggling, let's say garlic, and the guy's like, I'll just leave it there an extra month. We don't get that option. You don't get to just leave the crop out an extra month. So yeah, there's a lot of things that, because of the narrow window and because of the variability, it's one of the more challenging places to grow. But I don't think anybody would want their water bill either, right? So there's always pros and cons.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Perfect.
All right.
So it's clear in the chat and Q&A. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much. And yeah, we'll talk to everyone soon. Bye.
Take care.